This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Gunfire and fighting broke out in the Sudanese capital Khartoum over the weekend between two different factions of the Sudanese armed forces, causing dozens of deaths and hundreds of casualties. What led to the clashes? What is the situation now? And could the conflict escalate into a regional war? To answer these questions and more, we are joined in the first half of the program by Einar Tangen, independent current affairs commentator, and Wang Jin, associate professor at Northwest University of China. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Welcome to the discussion. So, Einar, we'll start with you. We know there's a fighting, and it's the third day now. So, do we know the reasons, why there is the fighting in the first place, and what they are fighting for?
Well, there's been an uneasy alliance between these two since they got together and helped overthrow Bashir. And since that time, it's kind of become an issue because they wanted to merge these two forces together, but they can't agree on what's going on. Plus, there's another issue that hasn't really been discussed much, which is the fact that about a month ago, it was agreed that the Russians would be able to use an area there for a naval base. And this also has separated them, with the warlord saying that he feels that Russia should do that, and the general who's in charge of the armed forces right now saying that he's going to go slow on that, does not want to alienate the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wang Jin, we know they are important forces. We know this country is also in the procedure to basically transitioning from the military rule to the civilian rule. It has been going on for years, since 2019 when the former president was overthrown, and they have formed this group. But now we have some very different development. So do we expect that the procedure will continue to return the power to the civilian rule?
I think the problem about an internal conflict might continue in the future because, as just Tangen mentioned, that there were computations and divisions about how to distribute the political powers and how to make the policies with the external powers. So actually, there was some division, and these divisions actually reflected the deeply rooted problem inside Sudan. That is how this kind of the country should be transformed from, as you mentioned, the military rule to this civilian government. Although we know that according to the constitution, temporary constitution of Sudan, that they are still in the process of transformation from the temporary situation of military rule to the direction of the civilian rule. But there were still some problems. So, for example, social problem and economic difficulties and sanctions from some Western countries, and also the divisions inside the military forces, especially some of the military regular forces and some of the militias that not very regular, but also still very powerful military factions inside Sudan. These are the problems might continue in the future. So we need patience, and we need efforts from international society and also especially some powers to help these local different powers to sit down together to launch dialogues to help settle these difficult divisions. But again, this will be a long way, and also means that we need a lot of patience and lots of efforts to help them.
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, we know, these two factions we mentioned of the armed forces. One is, of course, this official armed forces, basically the Sudanese army. It's led by basically the country's leader, or de facto leader right now. And another force is the so-called Rapid Support Forces, or RSF. So they are obviously have a different, let's say, vision or expectation for the new government or for the new governing body in terms of where they will be or what kind of power they are going to have, because both sides are part of the, let's say, armed forces. What are they asking for? In what way? Maybe, there will be a solution or settlement in terms of interest here.
No, I mean, this is purely about power. As my colleague has put it very clearly, Abdel Fattah Burhan wants to be on top, and the current head of the forces, General Mohammed Hamdou Daglo, he wants to be on top, and there's only room for one. They've had this power sharing for quite some time, obviously. With the deterioration of the country. I mean, it's in dire economic straits. Basically you have two forces battling it out for what is left, and there is not much left.
Wang Jin, in speak of this country, tell us more about the background. We know it in the transitional period. What about the economy or their relationship with the Arab world, the relationship with the Western countries? You talked about the sanctions, some of them lingering probably, and so there's probably very little investment from outside, and as a result, not much development. We talked about this very earlier. That's a bread revolution. That's in 2019. Many people call it like a democracy revolution, but actually it's really about people's daily lives, whether the government can provide what people need, the basic needs. Is the situation any better now?
We hope that the situation could be better, but just as we mentioned that the economic difficulties are still there, and about a quarter, nearly 25 or 26% of the Sudanese, they still live under the line of the poverty. So actually, the economic, social difficulties are still there. Because when we're talking about Sudan, we have to remember Sudan, the third largest country in the Africa. It is a very large country with a population about 46 or 45 million people. I mean, also with big population. And if you look at inside this population, they have different tribes, they have different areas, they have different social groups. So actually, it is a country with a very complicated social diversities. So when we're talking about this country, how it can develop economy, traditionally, Sudan's economy actually largely depended upon the oils from its south. I mean, but then we know that the South Sudan became independent about 10 years ago. So then it's a big part of the revenues, especially the oil revenues for the government, then lost. So now the Sudan actually at the time of transformation, not only the political transformation from, we mentioned the military rule to the civilian rules after 2019, but also actually the transformation of economic structure and economic system, hope to find new investments from the abroad, and also hope to find new revenues that can help to reconstruct the state. But again, as the sum of the sanctions from the Western countries, especially from the United States, who claimed that the Sudanese Sovereignty Council, led by its chair Burhan, are doing some bad things, so-called bad things at home. So the economic and social difficulties are still there. I think we still need a long way to before that we can witness a real, very, very good development of its economy and its social structures. So we need patience, and also we need assistance from international community.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wang Jin, you mentioned the difficulties here. We know, in 2019, there's a coup which overthrew the former President Omar al-Bashir. And then, at that time, who had already ruled this country for nearly 3 decades. And after that, we know there was a joint military-civilian control of the country that was, overthrown again in another coup by the military in late 2021. Since then, 2 years have been gone. There have been calls to return control of the country back to civilian leadership. But what has, probably, stopped this process or blocked this process from going ahead and realize its goal of a civilian control?
The civilian control from the military ruled government to the civilian government is it's very difficult. Although we know that they might set a gender, they might set a kind of the transition timeline. But when it's going to the implementation, it's going to the reality, it will face a lot of difficulties in the realities. For example, as we mentioned, the social and economic unrest resulted from the poverty. And because Sudanese had a large population, but then the jobless rate and the unemployment rate are very high, and even some people they have the job, but the salaries are not so much. And meanwhile, as we mentioned, the resources that is kept in the South Sudan, but now they become independent states, so they do not have the very reliable and sustainable revenues for the country. So actually, social and economic problem will always be there, that obstacle for the very smoothly transformation from military rule to the civilian government. Meanwhile, there were some internal competition, as just what we see that is happening inside Sudan, that the different factions inside the government or inside the military forces, they actually trying to compete with each other for the much more power. So some of them represent the regular forces, but some of them maybe represent the local forces, and some of them represent the very professional military forces, and some of them represent the militias that come from the non-regular forces. So actually, different factions want to more power, more voices in the political arena. So that all of these factors that lead to the difficulties of transformation from the military rule to the civilian rule government.
Mm-hmm. Anna, could the fighting become wider and even prolonged or turn into a regional conflict, if not regional, nationwide? Right now, we know that the clashes are focusing in the capital area, the Khartoum city there. So what about the prospect of, somehow, we are able to stop the clashes and then return things to order, at least, if not long-term, temporary, and we can have time to solve the problems?
Well, at this time, within the last hour, there were reports of fighting in Darfur and also the port of Sudan. So at this juncture, it is not closing down and not limited to Khartoum. It is spreading around. How long they can do this is going to depend on how much ammunition. But with some countries, throwing ammunition around the world, you never know, where it's going to end up. So obviously, there's can only be one individual in charge. I don't know that these two can mend fences, given their forces have been killing each other, and as well as civilians. So it doesn't look good for the country unless there's some sort of military victory. That is not clear that that's going to happen. So unfortunately, another prolonged intervention and what seemingly outside forces involved. Especially the United States, both in terms of sanctions and also their determination not to allow Russia to have a military base in that country.
Mm-hmm. Well, Wang Jin, speak of external forces or the impact from outside. In the rare moment of unity, the US, Russia, EU, and China are all calling for an end to the violence in Sudan. Africa's, we know that third largest country, the Arab League, on Sunday also called for an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. If the conflict continues to escalate, is there a possibility that external intervention might be needed or might be, to happen? And also by whom, which country or which group of country have this legitimacy or the trust to intervene, or in what way? Peaceful intervention or military intervention?
I think that if the conflict actually continues in Sudan, as we mentioned, that not only in the capital but also in the Darfur and other regions. So actually, on the one hand, the conflict started to escalate in certain areas, and also on the other hand, it started expanded into the other parts of the country. So that is very dangerous sign that in the future that the conflict might not be so easy to end. So against this backdrop, that maybe that we're talking about the need for the intervention, into Sudan to stop this expansion of warfare. But no matter who intervenes, and no matter the intervention goes through what kind of way, that the authorization from the United Nations, especially United Nations Security Council, are the first priority, are the very precondition for this kind of intervention. And in history, if you look at the conflicts in Arab states and also in the African countries, for example, Arab League, they can organize a kind of the peacekeeping forces to help intervene, and the African Union, they also have the experience of organizing the peacekeeping forces to help to separate the rivalries to keep the peace locally. So actually, the regional countries, they have the experience and they have the willingness and capabilities to do so. But no matter what way and who organizes, the first priority is that the authorization from United Nations and the assistance from international society.
Well, thank you, Wang Jin. Let's have a short break. When we are back, we'll take a look at the controversy surrounding French President Macron's talk or calling for more independence for the EU. Stay tuned. Well, French President Emmanuel Macron has called on Europe to resist the pressure to become America's followers when it comes to confrontation with China over the Taiwan question. His comments have drawn quite an amount of criticism, but at the same time, some European leaders have thrown their weight behind the stance of pursuing strategic autonomy and reducing dependence on the U.S. Joining us in the second half of our program to discuss this issue are Daniel Gros, Director of Institute for European Policymaking, and Julien Hoez, geopolitical expert and editor of the French Dispatch. Welcome. Let's say, Julien, we'll start with you. You know, there's a lot of, that's the criticism or strong rhetoric after President Macron's remark, on Taiwan, on the more independence of the EU. So he talked about the great risk Europe faces is that it gets caught up in the crisis and are not ours, and was referring to why the European Union should be dragged into a confrontation between the U.S. and China. So what do you make of the his remarks and also the blowback about his remarks?
So to begin with, the response to the remarks came from three specific things. One, there was an article in Politico that represented his comments in a very bizarre way that were a lot more negative than it needed to be. The second one is born out of a misunderstanding of the actual position of the European Union when it comes to Taiwan and China. And the third one comes from the simple fact that people just do not speak French. And if you read the article, which I translated and explained on the interview, which I translated and explained on the French Dispatch, the comments are very, very similar to every other comment that Macron has made on strategic autonomy, and they are not as controversial as many people say. The comments on strategic autonomy are things that have been said by US presidents and US congressmen and US senators for the last 20 or 30 years, and a lot of it comes down to one very simple thing, which is, as you said, Europe should not be dragged around by other great powers, and we should be able to make our choices based on what's in our interest. Which, contrary to popular belief, does not mean that we will unilaterally go to war with China because the US does, or that we will abandon Taiwan for whatever reason. It is a simple fact that we need to be in a position to measure our own interests and act accordingly.
Mm-hmm. Well, Daniel, do you think there's a universal or a conformed stance in terms of the Taiwan question? As we said, the US and China probably are competing for geopolitical influences, or the US is trying to maintain its hegemony, its dominant position in Asia. And so where is the stance of the EU countries?
I mean, you have 27 EU countries and maybe 27 nuances of the same idea. That same idea is simply that Europe and the United States share common values. They are together now in fighting or trying to hold off Russian aggression in Ukraine. But they have also areas where they have different views. Climate change is one, China is another, trade is another one. And therefore, it's always a continuum, whether you say the commonalities are more important or the differences. So in that sense, my French colleague is right. Macron didn't say anything new, but the way he said it and the way it was spun by the press made it appear that Europe should basically do what it wants without looking too much at the United States. And that's something which is very much discussed in Europe, and nobody really has a clear idea what we want, because every country thinks, first of all, about its own interests.
Well, Macron may be, hasn't said anything completely new in terms of the stance, but his remarks obviously have sparked not only a controversy inside the European continent, but also, negative backlash from U.S., in particular, some politicians here, like Mike Gallagher, chair of the House Select Committee on China, told Fox News that Macron's statements were embarrassing and very geopolitically naive. In the released video, U.S. Senator Marco Rubio repeatedly questioned Macron's remarks. Let's take a look.
I think this is a good moment for us to ask Europe, does Macron speak for all of Europe? Is Macron now the head of Europe? Is he now the most powerful leader in Europe? Because if he is, then there's some things we're going to need to change. Number one, Europe, including France specifically, has depended heavily on the United States for 70 years for their own defense. In fact, when Macron tried to play global superpower and send troops to North Africa to fight terrorists, he couldn't even get his own troops there. We had to fly them there, and we had to fly them back. He couldn't even get his own troops there. So if they're going to break off on their own and follow Macron's lead, that's going to save us a lot of money. As far as not getting involved in other conflicts that are not ours, we need to ask Europe, does he speak for them? Because we're pretty heavily involved in Ukraine right now. We're spending a lot of our taxpayer money on a European war. And I've supported that because I think it's in the national interest of the United States to be allies to our allies. But if our allies' position, if in fact Macron speaks for all of Europe and their position now is they're not going to pick sides between the US and China over Taiwan, then maybe we shouldn't be picking sides either. Maybe we should basically say we're going to focus on Taiwan and the threats that China poses, and you guys handle Ukraine and Europe. So we need to find out, does Macron speak for Macron or does Macron speak for Europe?
Mm-hmm. Well, Anna, the United States has been talking about or been urging European countries or NATO members to be specific, to increase their military spending, so they will be able to be capable of defending themselves. And now they are talking about probably, it's not really bad, to have this security protection or provide the protection for the European Union so they can follow us.
Well, I mean, look, first off, let's talk about Marco Rubio. This is the same gentleman just a few days ago who said that, if there's de-dollarization continues, we won't be able to put tariffs on people and make them do what we want. I mean, I don't think he understands the irony of what he's saying. This is exactly why, Europe suffered too under the unilateral tariffs that were imposed by the U.S. That's part of the equation, why they say we can't rely on the U.S. So at this juncture, Marco Rubio represents this kind of, red, white, and blue, our way or the highway. And, Europe is trying to figure out a way. There is this growing realization. I mean, today, the U.S. overtook all other sources of energy to Europe. They are now the largest supplier of energy to Europe. Well, why did that happen? Because of the Ukraine war. Yes, the U.S. is pouring millions of dollars in, but they didn't do it before the war started, all right? When they assumed that it would be, Putin would roll in and take over, and they would use it as a PR issue. And at this juncture, what are they doing? They're prolonging a war, which is killing thousands of people, displacing millions, and it's not clear that there's anything. This idea that, unless you follow us, you're our enemy. I think that is not going to sit well with most Europeans, despite the fact that they're divided east, west, north, and south.
Mm-hmm. Well, Julien, I wonder what's the response, or what would be the response from the public, when people hear what said by Marco Rubio, like, from the French Republic, let's say?
I mean, just as was said, Rubio should probably be careful of what he's saying, considering the fact that with the internet we have access to all of his previous decisions and comments. I mean, we're talking about a man who was pretty happy to support Donald Trump when Donald Trump was saying we may not actually back our allies if there is a war in Europe, and NATO Article 5 may mean nothing. And I think he should also maybe revise his geopolitics, because the Americans aren't in Ukraine as a favor to us. In no way, shape or form are they. They're doing this as a geopolitical play because Russia, first of all, is attacking a fellow democratic sovereign country and needs to be defended, but also because for the more hawkish among the Republicans, they're still looking for a victory over Russia and they see an opportunity here. Now, I'm not going to say they're unnecessarily prolonging any suffering because they're defending an ally, which is important. But in France, I think people would find that very comical because the French military is among one of the most independent and is able to ferry around its own soldiers and marines and airmen very simply. I think what most French people would think as well, actually, is that the Americans should probably stop trying to have their cake and eat it too. They keep complaining about how we're dependent on the US. We know. This is what Macron was saying, and this is why Macron is saying that we need to become more independent. And while there is a sort of vassalization by proxy happening in many ways in this relationship, what we want, at least in France, and I know many of my colleagues across Europe would like this too, is to have a relationship where we are a proper partner, an equal partner, and able to fully support our allies when necessary, which, as Macron said, due to our aligning interests, will most likely be the United States. But that doesn't mean we need to be in a position where we can be bullied by Marco Rubio, who has a random opinion that he thinks can get him on the primary ballot for next year's elections.
Mm-hmm. Well, Daniel, if you look at the European Union, they are the largest economy. If you look at the group, what's wrong with the calling for being more independent or strategic autonomy?
The problem is always how to actually implement that idea. It's all good to say we are independent or we have some strategic autonomy. But what does it mean in practice? It's one thing to have a discussion of whether Macron speaks for Europe or Marco Rubio speaks for the United States, and then say each side is inconsistent. I think that's not very useful. The concrete issues which are in front of us, let's say in Europe, are, for example, in trade with China, investment with China and in China, and other things. And I think these are the issues we should concentrate upon. And then we can see whether in the concrete implementation of policies, there's actually a large difference between the United States and us, and to what extent the differences that exist are actually justified by different circumstances and different interests. I think that's the level of discussion we should have, not who said what and when.
Mm-hmm. Well, Julien, speak of the differences. Of course, the U.S. has been conducting this decoupling from China, economically and technologically, and the EU Commission President, talked about de-risking. What's the difference? I mean, it sounds like similar.
I mean, they are quite similar, and let's be honest, a lot of it is political linguistics and just finding the right terms to describe what you want in a different way to someone else who said the same thing. But I think really, going back to the topic of strategic autonomy, it really is a case of we need to figure out what we want to do and how. I mean, if you look at what the US accomplished very recently with the Inflation Reduction Act, they managed to double investment into the manufacturing sector since it's been announced. And this is the kind of thing that Europe needs to be looking at, and looking at reinforcing our industries with this European Act that was touted by Macron and the Commission plans in order to try to make our economies more green. But it is a big problem overall in that, sure, we're using linguistics, we're talking, we're having conversations and everything. But then the problem is that once we have this conversation, or when a president like Macron makes a comment, everybody gets incredibly upset about it and doesn't want to talk about it in any concrete terms, and instead reduces themselves to local politics or playing to the gallery in the United States. And this is the real issue that we have in Europe right now, in that we have some people who want to move forward, and we have some people who want to stand still, alongside the people who want to move backwards and even fall backwards in some cases, which is the big issue we have.
Well, quite mixed opinions over there. With that, we come to the end for today's discussion. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.